Hey y'all, Wednesday night is not what it is. It is New Year's Eve, Friday night. Appreciate you guys showing up. If you're here, if you're not, again, every time you watch these videos, I'm honored and I appreciate it because I don't put these out just to put these out, right? I put these out because there was a period of time when I didn't have information and I needed it, particularly when it came to figuring out the legislative process and what it meant to leverage my experience and my voice in a way that was proactive and not necessarily traumatic all the time. Anyway, I wanted to end this show with a thought, and that thought for you is reentry. I'm in my 21st year post-incarceration, 8th year after my parole is ended. And I promise you, I'm dealing with some of the same kind of scenarios and issues I dealt with when I first got out of prison. Some of the same things that, create those kind of feelings that make someone feel like, they don't have a choice but to go back. I just happen to have built this foundation of being surrounded by folks who are supportive and people who understand my history, but everybody doesn't have that. So right now, many of the people in jails and prisons are locked up for technical violations, not new crimes. And, I was one of those folks who was locked up for a technical violation because I had tested positive for marijuana. And the reason why I tested positive for marijuana, obviously, besides the fact I was smoking it, but I could not afford therapy. And I could not afford therapy, and I definitely couldn't afford any medication because I didn't know I qualified for Medicare. So that there was no information. B, I didn't have employment that came with insurance that carried a prescription plan, right? So me not being able to find employment precluded me from not being able to have access to therapy, which ultimately meant I was self-medicating. That self-medicating led to me being violated on parole. Now, what's frustrating is my parole officer didn't find himself responsible for helping me find a job. That he felt like that was not part of his job description. And I don't blame him for that because he had a director that came down to him. However, his concern was more about me being violated and making sure that he did that process properly as opposed to figuring out why I was using it in the first place. So, the trauma of trying to be a son, trying to be a father, trying to be a brother, trying to be a husband, coupled with trying to be a provider, trying to be a protector. And all of those pathways are blocked by a scarlet letter. And so, I just want us to think about coming into this next year, what can we do beyond incarceration when it comes to technical violations? In particular, folks shouldn't be violated for not being able to maintain a current address when it's difficult, particularly across the country where there are no fair chance housing ordinances. That's just setting folks up to fail. So, just thinking about the folks that are now where I was when I got violated in 2006, I mean, just to be transparent, the reason why I started working in a strip club in 2006 after I got violated was because there was no one else who would hire me. And the strip club didn't do background checks for DJs. All I had to do was prove I had a voice and a knowledge of music and being able to manage people in a hostile environment. So, but, I did that for 10 years. So it wasn't until I came into advocacy work that I realized that there was a different purpose for my voice that I could have been living in had I had the opportunity. So I think that's the word I want to use for 2022 is opportunities. empowering people through opportunity, and then policy wish list. If we're going to work this next year to build power, if we're going to work this next year to make sure that people that are most directly impacted by the negative conditions that exist because of the American criminal legal system, then I want us to think about ending all restrictions on professional licenses for justice and system impacted people, firstly. And just to dig down in it a bit, as we talk about fair chance opportunities, it's not just about having a fair chance at a job, it's about having a fair chance at life. And people can't have a fair chance at life if there's this glass ceiling above them because they can't get a professional licenses based on something they did 20 or 30 years ago. We need to end any and all incarceration for technical violations. That's for parole and probation. There's no reason why we should be resorting to incarceration as a means to correct something that, folks have already been punished. That was part of their sentencing. Once they've been incarcerated and paroled, reincarcerating them is not correcting the behavior. It's punishing them in a way that is debilitating their future. And so we ought to rethink what incarceration is doing to folks as a result of breaking a rule and not a law. Thirdly, centering healing and forgiveness as a universal strategic operative. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, when we think about every other great policy push that we're talking about, voting rights, abortion rights, access to healthcare, right? When we're thinking about that, we're thinking about that for the greater good of all, right? Well, when we think about the impact of incarceration, what has been the greater good of all? For the last 300 years, we've used punishment. For the last 300 years, we've used jail cells as a means to stem crime, as a means to keep people safe, as a means to end the violence on our streets. And I would beg the question, how well has it worked? And in the absence of that answer, what betides us is a situation where we're consistently looking at the most effective means of correcting something that has no root in a jail cell. There is no root to crime in a jail cell. That begins way before a person enters the system. There's trauma, there's poverty. There are conditional aspects that have resulted in a person being incarcerated that a jail cell can't solve. And I just want us to think about using healing and forgiveness when we're thinking about this. Now, I'm not just talking about the folks who have harmed someone. We're talking about the folks who have been harmed. We got to make sure that we make space to forgive them for feeling how they feel, and make sure that we open up a space for them to decide what accountability means, but also having that being counterbalanced in the presence of the person who harmed them. Otherwise, we're going to treat justice in absentia, and healing in absentia, rather. So justice has done nothing to bring our communities back together. Justice has done nothing to restore homes and families. Justice has done nothing to alleviate the impacts of poverty. And so if that's what we're going to look to the justice system to do, then we've got to rethink what justice means, to redefine that through a lens of forgiveness and healing. Fourthly, diversify leadership in a way that is reflective of the communities that we seek to empower and serve. It's almost impossible for us to have an issue or policy that isn't led by the people that are most directly impacted. I'm from Austin, Texas, and one of the most disconcerting things was to see a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on only white people. And while the sentiment was understood, it was frustrating because it was almost like there were no Black lives that really mattered to Black people, because we didn't wear the t-shirts. Now, I know that's being glib, and I'm not trying to be that glib. My point being that, if white liberals are the only ones fighting for criminal justice reform, if they're the only ones who are recognized as experts on criminal justice reform, then we have to, again, beg the question, how effective are we approaching the long vision of reform? Folks that look like the problem, as we call it, folks that look like people who are incarcerated should look like the folks who are fixing that situation. We don't look to an African Methodist Episcopal minister to come into a Jewish neighborhood and solve, problems that exist within the Hasidic Jew community. That would be insane. It wouldn't be insane, but it would be tone deaf, if you will. You get folks that look like those folks. And same with, having, a Jewish rabbi come into a Black community and be effective. Not that they can't, but why should they be burdened with that? Why should we saddle them with that, as opposed to getting Black folks and Black communities with being given the wherewithal, whether it be funding and training, whether it be, creating justice circles, whether it be creating these basic income programs, these guaranteed job programs that takes the burden of poverty off of folks so they can engage in politics, so they can engage in their community. We got to create situations that allow people to be the best versions of themselves possible, and I think we should put that burden on the government. Speaking of the government, universal health care for everyone. If we're going to fight for anything, we should be talking about universal health care, not just on a federal level. We should be talking about municipal level universal health care. We should be talking about state level universal health care. Someone that lives with a disability, epilepsy, there's no way that I would be able to have the level of care that I have now if I was unemployed, right? And, folks shouldn't be penalized with death because they can't see a doctor or can't afford a doctor. America is one of the only places where people die from curable diseases because they can't afford a doctor. And we can change that. We have the power to change that. We all deserve a fair chance, right? So anyway, last rant of the year, we're going to bring folks from the Florida Restoration Rights Coalition. I've been going back and forth with them on text. My sister LaTanya Tate down there in Alabama, I've been talking about bringing her on as well. But going into this next year, just to give you a heads up, I'm going to really be focusing on New Jersey. And I'm going to be focusing on fair chance in New Jersey. I'm going to be focusing on right to compete, as they call it here, which is a glorified version of bed in a box. And we're definitely going to have to do more to make sure that people have access to employment, particularly as industries are suffering from not having enough employees. We got to figure out ways to engage people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system that want to work, that can't work because of a barrier based upon either applying for a job, a credit check, a background check. Just to be, again, transparent, even though they passed the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance in New Jersey, my credit score was still one of the things that precluded me in the beginning from securing housing. So this next year, as I'm talking about policy issues across the country, I'm going to be focusing on New Jersey, fair chance hiring, fair chance career events. We're going to be talking about ways to bring together a coalition of folks who are interested in restricting the impact of incarceration and post-incarceration has on New Jerseyans. All right, I appreciate you guys so much. You have an amazing, amazing rest of your 2021. You got about 2 hours left, and then we're going to kick back in 2022. All right, I love you all. Talk to you soon. Stay safe. Stay powerful, stay connected, stay networked, and